we'll get going for the week. Welcome to Playing with Unicorns, episode 9. This week we're going to talk about how to come up with brilliant startup ideas. So one of the common problems I encounter when I talk to potential entrepreneurs, they tell me, look, I know how to execute, but I just don't have this brilliant idea that I want to build and that is going to be successful. And they're at a loss at how to come up with these types of ideas. Now, the good news for if you're a founder and you don't have an idea but you want to execute is that the genius is actually in the execution, not necessarily in the idea itself. In fact, if someone came to me and said, hey, I have the best idea in the world. It's going to be the next $100 billion company or idea. How much would you be willing to give me of your company in exchange for that idea? The answer is actually very little. Definitely sub 5%, probably sub 1%, because the real genius is in the ability to execute the idea, not in the idea itself. That said, you do want to pick an idea that is going to be good. And given that every year at FJ Labs, we are coming up, we are building one or two new companies de novo, we need to be coming up with the ideas on a constant basis. And so we actually thought through, okay, what is the process that we're using to come up with these ideas? And so I want to share that with you. So basically, we use a two-step process, and in fact, I'm going to split this episode into two. One is coming up with the ideas, and next week I'll cover how to evaluate and validate that these ideas are actually valid and are worth pursuing. And each of these two steps, frankly, has two sub-steps, because beyond the ideation phase, or coming up with the ideas, you want to do a very quick test. Like, does this idea even make sense? Does it make sense to allocate time to it? Once you've done this, and I put that in the ideation phase because these are very quick validations or tests to verify that it is interesting. Once you've done that, there's two next steps, which is one, what is it you need to prove or disprove to decide whether or not pursuing these ideas? So identifying the key hypothesis, thinking through what the unit economics are going to look like, and all the things you need to test. Is the market fragmented enough? Is it large enough, etc.? And then actually going back and testing the hypothesis, which could be a lot of things. It could be focus groups, it could be online surveys, it can be interviewing potential clients, it could be doing landing page analysis, etc. But we'll cover all of this later. Today I want to focus first on the ideation phase and then on the quick verification. So what we found, as we interviewed all the founders, frankly, all the members of FJ Labs, in terms of how they came up with their ideas, there are four fundamental sources of ideas. So one is observed pain points. So you are either living or experiencing things that really grate at you, that have really bad user experiences, whether it's like applying for getting a mortgage, which is a horrible experience, or one of the famous examples here is when Reed Hastings created Netflix. It's because he was dinged by late fees when returning his DVD to Blockbuster. He was so annoyed that they wouldn't waive those late fees that he decided to build Netflix and ultimately, of course, turned the industry on its head and killed Blockbuster. Second big source of ideation is geographic arbitrage. So taking an idea from one country where it's working and bringing it to another country. And I'll explain, when and why, when it can work and in what cases it should work. Number three is business model. I don't know if it's arbitrage, but like taking a business model or an approach that seems to be working in a given vertical or in a given category and applying it to other categories. And last but not least is actually thinking through, of these large sites that exist, what subcategories or what specification you can have and take one of the categories and go very deep in it. And of course, there's that very famous slide that David Haber created on all the sites that are attacking Craigslist, side by side. But the reality is, beyond Craigslist, this verticalization can happen to all the multi-category sites. So it's happening to Upwork, it's happening to Thumbtack, it's happening to Uber Eats. And we're going to cross or discuss a few examples. Now, a common theme that we're going to discuss as we ideate is a lot of these ideas actually will meet more than one of these criteria. So let's take the example of Slice. So Slice is a Uber Eats for pizza in a way. It's a pizza food ordering company idea. Now, it's an example of a vertical, but actually this is not where it started. It started as a pain point observed because the founder's family has been in the pizza space forever. His parents, his cousins, his uncles, his grandparents all ran pizza stores. And the main observation he realizes all those people got in the business because they loved cooking pizza. They loved interacting with their customers. And once you start a small business, you realize that you end up spending most of your time doing things you don't like doing your accounting, getting a POS system, doing packaging, picking up the phone, creating online websites, answering comments with TripAdvisor, etc. So you created Slice to basically run all the back office operations of these mom and pop pizzerias, of which, of course, in the US, there are 50 or 60,000, and they account for 66% of the market, and let them do what they love doing. And by observing them, by actually living through their pain point, because he actually worked in pizzerias growing up, given that his entire family was in it, he was able to find the solution that worked for them. And of course, it also crosses with this other theme of verticalizing companies like Uber Eats, and they've done really, really well. They're in the hundreds of millions of sales. They only take 9% per order. Well, versus 20+% for other aggregators, and by helping solve the back office, they found in a way a unique hack for getting customer acquisition without competing with the Uber Eats or Seamless Grubhubs of the world, because they're really converting the existing customers of the pizzerias to their business. So in this case, he lived through it. His family lived through it. He said, I had to fix it, and he was exactly the right person to fix it. And in fact, that will probably lead into another point that's probably worth making in general. Even though an idea is good, it may not be worth pursuing. You need to be the right person to pursue the idea, because once you make that commitment that you pick an idea, you're going to live it and breathe it for the next 5, 7, 10 years. It might be more than 10 years if the company does extremely well. And so something you need to be really passionate about, and we need to find this idea founder fit. Next big rule of ideas is geographic arbitrage, taking an idea that works in one country and bringing it to another country. Now, the main reason that typically works is, first of all, humans are pretty similar around the world. In every country in the world, we want to be entertained, we want to communicate, we want to socialize, we want to find a semblance of meaning in our lives. And as a result, the ideas that work in one country have a tendency to work in another country. Now, another reason, especially that geographic arbitrage from the US to the rest of the world really works, is for most US companies, it's probably not worth it for them to go to the rest of the world. Taking their eye off the ball and distracting them by going elsewhere will decrease the probability of winning in the US. And by the way, the US, the valuations are higher, the markets are easier to operate in, you can probably ultimately buy all the companies in all the other countries. In fact, our recommendation to our portfolio companies when they're in the US is don't bother with the rest of the world. If you're at 100 million in the US, it's easier to go from 100 to 200 in the US than 0 to 100 anywhere else. It's easier, and that's true. It keeps being true. If you're at 1 billion, it's easier to go from 1 billion to 2 billion than 0 to 1 billion anywhere else. And that, even if it's a 5%, 10% decrease in your probability of winning in the US, it's completely not worth it. Now, the exception to that rule is if you have user-generated content, then of course, pure Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, obviously you go global. But most companies, there's supply chains, there's payments, etc., not worth it. If you're in the US, win the US, eventually you can consider it or acquire the other players. And that's why, Mercado Libre, which is an eBay originally for Latin America, now kind of turning into Amazon for Latin America, was able to emerge. The payment infrastructure was different. The needs, the categories were different from what eBay was offering in the late 90s and early 2000s. And the specificity of Mercado Libre made a lot of sense, especially since it was not an area of focus for eBay. In fact, eBay, for a fair amount of time, actually partnered with them and owned a small percentage of the company. Now, of course, over time, that they became the leader in the category. Now the company is worth $60 billion. So it's a huge opportunity. And it's one that I've, in the past, actually often used as an idea source. My very first company was a company that I was copying eBay and bringing it to Europe, and ultimately helping create an eBay of Latin America, which kind of ultimately became Mercado Libre. So very valid idea. And most ideas that work in the US work in the rest of the world. The only exception would probably be ideas that require reasonably wealthy or reasonably high purchasing power. So maybe in the scooter business, like Lime, for instance, the underlying infrastructure cost, so buying the scooters, it's the same cost whether you're in China or whether you're in the US. But the revenue per mile that you can charge to customers varies dramatically. People in the US are willing to pay more given that everything else around them costs more, from subway to taxis, et cetera, Ubers. It's not true in China. The purchasing power is much lower. The willingness to pay is a lot lower, and therefore maybe the unit economics don't work there. But with that exception and these types of exceptions where the cost structure is the same around the world, but the revenues may vary, then most ideas from the US will work in the rest of the world, and it's a very legitimate. Now, you're never doing an exact clone. You're not like just copying and pasting. You need to adapt. You need to adapt to local mores, to local customs, local preferences, local payment systems, local suppliers, etc. So it's always an adaptation. Now, another big potential source of idea is bringing an idea from the rest of the world to the US. Now, here, you need to be somewhat careful because some ideas are dependent, for instance, on having a very low labor costs, and that might be true of ideas in Southeast Asia or in Africa or in Latin America. Bring those to the US might not make sense, but there's some ideas that just randomly emerge in the rest of the world first, and there may actually be very good reasons for it. So an example of that is a company we invested in Germany called Magaloop. It's a B2B marketplace between the distributor, the FMCG brands basically, and the bodegas and the corner grocery stores, the small independent grocery stores, where they get all of their supply. And it emerged in Germany because the distribution is reasonably long tail, and it's not really concentrated. You don't have very big grocery chains that control a big part of the market. And because of that same dynamic, we saw the same type of business emerge mostly in emerging markets. So we have Trade Depot in Nigeria, you have Capital in Egypt, you have Cheaper in Colombia and Mexico, and we saw like dozens of these models emerge all around the world before actually they came to the US. I think we saw 4 in Pakistan recently and considered investing in them. And so the B2B marketplaces between the FMCG brands and the grocery stores came to be in the rest of the world. And we thought long and hard, okay, in light of that trend, should it also exist in the US? And as we started looking at the fragmentation of both the supply and demand, we realized actually, yes, it did make sense to exist. And in fact, 2 companies ultimately emerged from it, which are still reasonably young, which are Mabel and Vori. And because we had invested and looked at all these companies in the rest of the world, we're like, okay, should we find the US equivalent or should we try to back them? And of course, in this case, the answer is yes, though we're not yet investors in either of them. But this is the type of idea that you can bring from the rest of the world to the US. In fact, there are a lot of innovations happening right now in China, in Europe, et cetera, that actually can be brought to the US and might be a source of idea generation. The third big source of idea generation, probably the one that's most common at FJ Labs because we see so many deals. We really have our fingers on the pulse of the market. We really see what are the trends, is actually taking a model or an approach that's working in a given vertical and then applying it to another vertical. So for instance, we are investors in RigUp. RigUp is a labor marketplace for oil services workers and oil workers in general, but they're expanding to other categories. And so they help companies like Schlumberger, an oil servicing company, find labor for the work they have. And it's very high skilled and very very specific. You may need a welder for your drill on a platform in the North Sea next week. And so you need someone that has the right skill for that specific drill, that is available at that specific point in time, and that has all the paperwork in order to be able to work in that country. And so it's a very different type of job than the type of jobs you could find on the traditional job sites, which are, LinkedIn, or the ZipRecruiters of the world, or the Indeeds of the world. And they created the vertical, and we were able to become transactional there. And so we started thinking through, okay, what, and other founders started thinking through, okay, what or other categories that could be verticalized. And we ended up investing in a company called Trusted, which is basically a vertical marketplace for nurses. Now, it makes a lot of sense because very often the hospitals or at capacity, they need extra labor. A lot of the nurses and the traveling nurses want flexibility, and they want to be able to find the right job for them when they're available. And so creating a vertical matching system for that category and being able to be an approved vendor in the systems of in the public and private hospitals made a lot of sense. And that company has grown and is now doing hundreds of millions in revenues and doing really, really well. Now, both like RigUp, they're trying to become, and beyond being just a job placement site and taking a percentage of the commissions, they're trying to become the LinkedIn of the category. So in the case of RigUp, they're already there. If you're in the oil sector, you are not on LinkedIn. All of your profile, your history, your life lives on RigUp, and they've become the de facto leader in the category. And this approach is one that we're seeing now becoming very common across many other categories. So Advisable is helping people find marketing jobs on a contract basis, and by the way, these are also examples of verticalization. So again, across we're seeing a business model working in the category, and in this case, it's also vertical. Another example of that is Fresha. Fresha noticed that MindBody was really doing well when it came to fitness studios, and they said, okay, this dynamics, the client space is somewhat different. And so let's go and do the same thing, but for salon and spas. Now, again, this is another example. This is another example where there are multiple things happening. Not only is it the same approach or an approach that they've seen work in a vertical being launched in another vertical, they also changed the monetization. They're like, look, most of these small studios and salons and spas don't like to be monetized or being charged for their own customers making reservations. So instead of like charging either a SaaS fee or a booking fee, a la an open table, they said, okay, we will just aggregate so much volume, we will ultimately negotiate lower fees with the payment providers, and we'll give a lower fee to the payment to the salons and spa that they could get themselves, and we'll make a percentage of the rate. So they've normally went to a different vertical, but they also changed the business model, and that's rather typical. They took an approach that worked in another category and brought it here. And the last example is verticalization. Now, in a way, I mentioned that Slice was already a vertical of Uber Eats, so this is something that happened with Chowbus, a company that we invested in. And by the way, I think almost all the companies I mentioned today we're investors in. So Chowbus is a vertical, or it's an Uber Eats for Chinese food. Now, the reason it makes a lot of sense is multifold. First of all, they realized that a lot of the Chinese food restaurant owners were actually native Chinese speakers. Their English was not perfect, and so giving them tools to manage their back office, a la Slice, in both Mandarin and in English made a lot of sense. They also realized that especially Chinese immigrants to the US would order Chinese food 6 days a week, and they were usually on WeChat rather than WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger, etc. So they started using these acquisition channels that no one else was on to acquire customers really cheaply. And they've grown dramatically from, frankly, nothing a few years ago to now tens of millions in revenues per month and doing really, really well. Likewise, TCG Player. It's eBay for collectible card games, especially for Magic the Gathering and Pokemon. So first of all, most people would have said, wait a minute, that's too small. Why would this make sense? Well, reality is Magic the Gathering, believe it or not, is $4 billion a year and actually growing. And so it's a larger category than people expect. And the approach they've taken, they've realized, look, most of the inventory here lies into the comic book stores. In fact, the founder was a comic book store owner. So again, personal pain point that he noticed, which is the existing POS systems were not managing all the millions of SKUs in Magic the Gathering. So he decided to build his own tool. And then he realized, okay, the average order value per card is very low. Let's come up with a mechanism where we can actually serve orders, whether they be small or large, without actually having the unit economics be underwater. And so they built this management system. They gave it away to all the other comic book stores in the US and built their inventory. And over the years, in a very capital efficient way, grew to over 100 million in sales. In a way, the story is similar with Reverb. Again, it's a combination of a vertical. It's eBay, but for music instruments, and a personal pain point found by the founder who owned one of the most successful both new and used music store in Chicago. And realized it was really painful to sell on eBay. They were not very knowledgeable about the category, and so he built the best site for that with the best nuanced understanding of the products and created a credibility in the industry that allowed him to become a billion plus in sales and ultimately sell very successfully to Etsy. Now, these are the 4 types of sources of inspiration, right? So you can look at pain points in your life or in your friend's life. You can copy ideas from one market to the other, from the U.S. to the rest of the world, or the rest of the world to the U.S. You can look at business models that work in one category and bring them to others, or you can verticalize or debundle or unbundle categories that are working. But how do you actually see what's happening there? And frankly, the answer is, I don't know if it's kind of obvious, but it's more like you lead your life. And as you lead your life, just be aware. Be aware of the pain points that you meet. Have conversations with friends about the pain points that they're seeing, things they don't like in their life. When you come across a site that you love, like jot it down. Think through, what is it solving? How is it solving it? If there are sites that are even dominant today, think through, okay, are they still relevant? Is the way they're doing things still the right way to be doing things? Could they actually be disrupted in some way, shape, or form? And there are a lot of resources. I won't go through all of them because it's just reading a list is not particularly interesting, but this will be posted on my blog later at fabrizegrinda.com, and you'll be able to access the full presentation, of course, with a rerun of this. But if you want to see what are the new companies that are coming out, you can look at like Product Hunt or Trends.vc. Then there are podcasts like This Week in Startups with Jason Kalinakis. And then there are a bunch of newsletters like Strictly VC or Strategy, which I read. I'm not sure it'll surface new information, but it gives you really in-depth thought about the way the industry works. And then there are a lot of like thought leaders that are emerging, especially with specific topics, right? So in no-code, someone like Ben Tassell is becoming one of the thought leaders, and following what they write on Twitter or elsewhere is actually rather relevant. Okay, so now you've used this, you've actually come up with a number of ideas, and before you actually go down the rabbit hole and like interview people, do landing page analysis, etc., it's worth doing a quick validation. It's like small litmus test. So I'm not saying we're not at all in the real validation test phase. It's really more, okay, is this actually worth even allocating time to now that I found this? And there are 3 things that I usually look for. One is, how big is this category? And again, you're not going really fragmented to figure out how that specific segment of that category that you're going after is. That'll be in the validation phase. But it's more, okay, right now, if I look at the industry total addressable market size, can it support $1 billion business? And to build $1 billion business, you need a couple $100 million revenues. Typically means that the market size has to be $5 billion at least. Now, a few caveats to that. First of all, smaller markets have tended to be less competitive. So on average, and if you're going vertical, of course, it's going to be a smaller market than the horizontal, but it's still fine. I actually have a preference for somewhat smaller markets because they're less competitive, especially if one of 2 things are true. Either the approach you're taking allows you to grow the market, then it's then the fact the market may be small today is not that relevant. Or if you win in this category with this approach, perhaps you can go to a coin-join market, and so the TAM of both is large enough to make it compelling. But if something is only 50 million, 100 million, it's not worth going after. And so doing a quick scan to understand how big this is makes sense. Number 2, even though you had the idea, you may not be the first person to have the idea to tackle this. And so how much competition is there in the category? Have other people come up with the idea? Now, everything you do, most likely someone else will have thought of it. And the question is more, where are they and how far along are they? If it's like a bunch of early stage startups or like approaches that haven't been they're not very professional, not a big deal. If in the category of the idea you're going after, all of a sudden you see there are like 3 companies that are doing tens of millions of revenues, they've all raised tens of millions from all the major VCs in the US, I'd probably steer clear of that one. It feels like you're a bit late to that party, and you don't want to be in a hyper-competitive market. The red ocean versus blue ocean distinction that people sometimes talk about in business school. Of course, if you can avoid being in super competitive markets, better. Now, you'll always face competition. Never should deter you. If someone else is doing it, that's fine. But see how much funding they have, see how big they are, and how many people are going after this. And then number three, and I do care deeply about it, is can you make the economics of the business work? And to make the economics of the business work, and again, you're not going to be doing unit economic testing at this point. It's more, you just need, generally speaking, and that's true across everything, you typically need either a high average order value on a one-time transaction, or you need a lot of frequency. So if you're in real estate, people are buying a home, value is high enough that typically you can make money. Or if it's something like Uber, where you're taking Uber all the time, many times a month, you can also make it work. So I would just check what is the average order value and how frequently are people buying the product or the service. And if it's high enough in either case, then you're probably fine. And the way you check these things is there are a lot of actually statistics available. The US actually publishes a lot of statistics, and you have everything from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, Bureau of Labor Statistics. So actually, a lot of the market data is available. You can just Google it. Now, in terms of competitive data, the free one that's probably the easiest is Crunchbase. I mean, well, you Google, you check in TechCrunch if anyone else is doing it. Once you find the names of the companies, then you go to Crunchbase. If you have PitchBook, even better. Most people don't have access to PitchBook. Go to Crunchbase and you'll see the list of the investors, how much they've raised. It gives you a sense of how advanced the players in the category are. And then, of course, you can look at specific blogs in the category. I would actually look just for sentiment, not for, again, no surveys, nothing. Just see what people are thinking about in terms of pain points on Reddit, on Facebook groups, etc. And I have a few tips and tricks that you can look in terms of how to look for specific publication types or file type on Google. I'll let people read this later. Now, two other quick tips. If you're looking at a specific subreddit, you can actually look, there's a tool that allows you to look at all the related subreddits based on someone's posting behavior, and I've linked it, or it'll be in the presentation. You can just click on it. And of course, if you're looking at a company on LinkedIn, you can look at people also viewed. It'll show you all the other companies in the category, which makes a lot of sense. Now, how do we do it at FJ Labs? So we actually use that framework of ideation to come up with the ideas. And in our case, twice a year, we invite all of the company, and I really mean everyone, from the CFO to the office manager to the investment team to the apprentices to the entrepreneurs and residents whose job it is to come up with ideas, and present their ideas to everyone. We find like 200, 250 ideas per year, so we do 2 sessions, usually at my place in Turks and Caicos. One in February, one in August. We come up with over 100 ideas each time, and then we vote on them. We decide whether or not it's appropriate for FJ. And then the entrepreneurs in residence decide, okay, of these ideas, let's evaluate a few. And the idea is to evaluate 2 to 3 at a time. It's not good to only evaluate one, because if you invest all your time in it and ultimately you drop it, it's like a massive letdown. And so if you're actually pursuing 2 or 3, you don't become too wedded to that idea that you leave. So I'd say 2 or 3. And so over the course of the year, we'll evaluate, let's say 20, and then we'll agree on 1 or 2 companies to build every year. So this is an example. So last year, this year actually, we came up with 247 ideas, and then we had members of the team, after they were presented, vote on them. Should FJ pursue it, or is it a good idea but not for FJ, or not a great idea? And then we stack ordered them, and then people pursued them. And then of the ideas that we pursued, when we looked 6 months later, a bunch of ideas we'd killed because some element didn't work, some ideas we're still evaluating, and this is how ultimately it worked. Now, switching gears, to give you an example of how that happens, I'm going to invite one of FJ's team members, Arnie, who co-heads investments at FJ Labs, and he's going to share the ideas that he came up with in the last session. So, Arnie, why don't you actually start by giving a little bit of your background, and then we'll dive into your ideas from August of 2020, so a few months ago.
Sure, sounds good. So thank you for having me. Excited to be on. So as Fabrice mentioned, I'm one of the people on the investment team. I co-lead the investment arm for Fabrice and Jose with my colleague Jeff, who was on last week. And I've been with FJ since the beginning of the fund in early 2016. I'm Norwegian, grew up in Norway, did my education there, did a master's degree in engineering, actually went through an entrepreneurship program during my master's program, so worked on a few startups there. And we actually had an ideation process that is quite similar to what FJ Labs does. And then once I graduated, I joined a telco group, a company called Telenor. I started in a talent program there and then gradually worked my way up, became director of global partnerships, moved to San Francisco for them, stayed there a couple of years, worked with Google and Facebook and a few others for partnerships. And then Telenor invested into FJ Labs. So they were the anchor LP in both the first and the current fund. And through that, I bridged into FJ Labs and eventually joined the team full time. And as Fabrice mentioned, I'm going to talk through some of the ideas that I came up with for our most recent brainstorm. Before I go into that, I just wanted to add a few things to what Fabrice was talking about before. And I think the overarching thing for me here is don't treat this as a solo sport. I think ideation and brainstorming is something that goes much better if you have someone to spar with, someone to spitball with. So find a few people who are like-minded, interested in tech, interested in building things, and talk to them and bounce your ideas off of them. And as Fabrice mentioned, building startups is very much an execution game. So don't be too worried about sharing your ideas with others. You're more likely to get useful feedback and input than you are at risking anything by talking to others. And related to that, similar to building an MVP, you want to start getting external input early. Don't go very far down the line in your own head, digging into one idea before you start talking to others, because you might get very helpful input. So that said, let me start going through the ideas that I came up with for our last brainstorm.
Actually, maybe caveat that because different team member, everyone in the team is presenting, the level of idea, the level of depth of ideas that someone like Arnie, who actually has a full-time job co-heading the investment arm of FJ Labs, is not as in. It's more let's come up with the idea rather than let's actually do validation. And so it's more ideas that are maybe not as research, whereas the entrepreneurs in residence would actually go really in depth and have done a lot of work because that's kind of their full-time job.
Appreciate that context. I think that's helpful for people to know. So let me share my screen and then I'll run you guys through this.
I'm seeing your email right now, not your PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, good to go.
Okay, cool. All right, so kicking this off, I'm going to start with one of the ones that fall into the personal pain point bucket that Fabrice was talking about. So as I mentioned, I moved to the US in 2014 the first time. And ever since then, I've had to go through a visa process essentially every year, either to review the visa that I'm on or to find a new visa because my work situation has changed or things related to that. And usually I have to find counsel, I have to explain the situation, we have to come up with a strategy, and then you have to build the supporting documentation. A lot of it is the same documents every time. And then you have to build this into a packet, submit it, and it takes a lot of time. And it's a very manual process. But if you think about it, it's between 1 and 2 million people coming into this country every year to work. And that's a pretty substantial market. So if you could build a marketplace to help with the matching of these consumers to counsel, and then building the tools for counsel to manage this process in a more automated and streamlined manner, you could help them build their business in a very substantial way. So a SaaS-enabled marketplace for visa attorneys is something that could make sense based on that personal experience. Next up is more of a business model arbitrage. So as Fabrice mentioned, we see a lot of companies every year. And one of the companies that we got very excited about is a company called Coology. And it's a marketplace for in-home physical therapy based out of LA. And this is a very interesting company, both for the physical therapists and for the consumers, because it is covered by insurance. So for the consumer, you get a prescription for physical therapy, and that means that your out-of-pocket cost is going to be quite low. And for the physical therapists, you get a long treatment series. You get usually 10 to 15 sessions. So it's very attractive economics. And then I had an event in New York where I ran into a doctor who had turned investor. And we were talking about this idea. And he mentioned to me that chronic obstructive pulmonary disease is a disease that is quite expensive for insurance companies. People have very reduced lifespan, typically high risk of complications. And as a result, insurance companies are willing to pay a lot of money to prevent complications. And it's quite simple to prevent. If you have a simple, regular exercise regime, that can actually lead to massive cost savings. So taking the Coology model and applying it to COPD is something that could be potentially very interesting. The next one up is also a business model arbitrage. So we spoke to a company called ApplyBoard. It's a Canadian company founded in 2016. And what they do is to make it easier for international students to apply to universities in Canada. So they streamline the process so that you collect all the information that you need for all the different universities you're applying to in one place, and then they package it and send it to the different universities. And on the university side, they essentially function as an application tracking system, and it also helps them as an acquisition channel. And they've been growing very rapidly, focused pretty much exclusively on the Canadian market. And their natural extension would probably be the US. But in Europe, it could be very interesting to look at this model and essentially apply the same playbook. And then again, I spoke to a company that we were evaluating for investment. And this was a company that was focused on CPG, essentially consumer packaged goods. They were making food items. And they had algae as an important part of their ingredient list, which just made me curious about how big the algae market is. So I did a little bit of research and discovered that this is already a $10 billion market, and it's growing quite fast. And it's used in food, it's used in fertilizers and biofuels. But we haven't really come across any companies that try to facilitate the matching between the people who produce this and the people who use it. So again, this is an area that could be interesting to dig into to see if there are any marketplace opportunities. And this would probably be a B2B play. And from the algae, I started digging into other alternative food sources, which led me to insect meal. And when I started digging into that, if you look at feed for livestock and aquaculture, a lot of that comes from fish and plants today. But not too long ago, the EU changed their legislation to allow processed animal protein from insects. And for aquaculture in particular, insect feed actually has a better profile than plant-based foods. It has a better amino acid profile. It doesn't have the same fiber and starch content. And you can grow it very cost effectively. And potentially also it could be grown on farms, on land, as an additional revenue source as they lose revenue from a lot of the meat production that we expect to go away over the next decade or two. Another example of an idea that came from a conversation with a founder was this one. I spoke to a car marketplace, and they mentioned in passing a company called Insurance Auto Auctions, which is a $6.5 billion company. And what they do is that they take cars that have been considered totaled in the US by insurance companies, and they export them, and they sell them in other countries. And now some of you might think that this is unethical, but if you look at some of these markets, the standard of cars is actually substantially lower than in the US. And the legal threshold for what's considered a safe car is also much lower. So you could take a car that in the US is considered totaled because some of the sensors in the bumper have been damaged, and export it to one of these countries, and it would actually be an improvement in road safety. And when we see these types of incumbents that are large and not particularly innovative, if you have a look at their websites, I think you'll understand what I mean. That is a hint that there might be something interesting to do in a smarter, more tech-enabled way. And then the last bucket here are a couple of ideas related to waste. So I started digging into hazardous waste, and this is a pretty specific but large category. In the US, there's about 35 million tons per year of hazardous waste. Most of this is wastewater. So that's flow off from industrial processes, a lot of chemical manufacturing, and oil and coal. It's fairly concentrated in states. Most of it is Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. But it's quite fragmented. There's about 25,000 generators of hazardous waste in the US. And on the wastewater side, you could look into chemical manufacturing, so solvents, distillation residues, organics with benzene, etc. Or you could go into the petroleum and coal production side, look at solvents, tank sludges, and try to build B2B marketplaces for managing this waste for the waste generators. If you go into the solids, you could look at hospitals. So hospitals in the US generate about 950,000 tons per year. And this probably sounds small, but it's quite expensive to manage because it's hazardous. So it costs them about $2.36 per kilogram in management cost. So that's already a $2.2 billion TAM in the US just for hazardous waste, just in hospitals. So this also seems like an idea that could be interesting to dig into. So that's the last of them, and this essentially gives you a high-level view of how we think about coming up with these ideas on a very high level. And then from here, we would take these ideas and we would break them down further and do sort of a deeper diligence on them, both to look at the idea itself, but also if this is a good fit for the founder who's looking to start a company.
So if I'm not mistaken, we actually have not done a deeper dive on any of these.
I think that is correct.
Okay, well, if the audience is interested in taking any of these ideas and digging deeper, that's fine. Answering if
Definitely. We would love to see them.
Absolutely. In fact, sometimes we come with the ideas and they should exist. And so if we come up, if we build them, great. But if others want to go and build them, we're more than happy to fund them. We're, as Arnie said early on, there's no monopoly on ideas. And sharing the ideas, I think, is actually a really good idea. So answering a few of the quick questions, Sandeep, we do invest in pre-seed, angel rounds, and seed rounds, especially for service marketplaces. So feel free to send it our way. And guess a few questions for Arnie. So how long does it take from the starting of ideation to actually pulling the trigger?
Yeah, so that's, I would say that varies a lot because there's a lot of points along the way where you might decide to pull the plug on something. So as Fabrice mentioned before, typically we encourage our entrepreneurs and residents to work on 2 to 3 ideas in parallel and maybe go deep on one and sort of keep the other 2 a little bit more on the back burner, but keep working on them so that if you end up killing the first one, you have something else to fall back on. But if we look historically at our entrepreneurship program, typically people start working on ideation fairly full-time in the spring of the year that they graduate business school. A lot of our EIRs come from business school. And then usually it takes about a year from there until they start incorporating a company. Some are very fast. Some of them have actually started before they even graduate. Some of them start companies in the fall. And some of them take longer because the ideas that they start digging into don't materialize. They find problems with the ideas that make them, at the end, move away from that idea and dig into others. But what's important to keep in mind here is that for most of these entrepreneurs, they have looked at many tens of ideas. Some of them have looked at 70 plus ideas before they decide to pull the trigger on one.
How much do you worry about competition when you're ideating and validating?
Not a lot. And it very much depends on who the competition is. So if your competition are large incumbent players, I probably wouldn't worry about it at all. The exception is probably if it's Facebook or Amazon building something that is very close to their business and they can put a ton of resources behind it and leverage their existing power and network to grow it, then I would probably be hesitant. The other situation where I would be worried about competition is if you're going into a category that is already very crowded. If there's a lot of tech companies early stage going after the same segment that have raised VC capital, that means you're going to have to fight for attention, especially on the capital side. Maybe not so much on the consumer side, but on the fundraising side, it's going to be hard for you to get attention and get the rounds done that you need. But as Fabrice mentioned before, this is very much an execution game. It's really down to you to build a great company, build a great culture, and grow really fast. And most companies die internally before they die from competition. Founders end up having different visions for the company, or they end up in conflict. They can't find product market fit. There's a lot of issues that I would be concerned with before I worry a lot about competition.
So Zach wants to know, what if someone wants to run with these ideas, but they have very little experience in that vertical? Is it better to leave it to someone else, or could they still pursue it?
If you have very strong passion for it, I would probably try to find a way to make it work and to validate the idea in a good way. What we see with a lot of B2B marketplaces is that they're typically more successful if you have someone in the team who's an insider, someone who knows the industry, they know the lingo, they have a network, they have intimate familiarity with the pain points. And then they team up with someone who has more of the tech expertise, someone who's built tech companies, have a very strong challenger mindset, know how to build a tech stack, know how to do marketing. And if you team those two up, that can be a very powerful combination. So if you have an idea and you have an industry that you're excited about, I would try to find someone who complements you and who knows that space very well, who you work with well, and see if you can team up and do it together. Because I think that insight and that very, very strong, deep knowledge can definitely be extremely helpful, both in validating that the idea makes sense the way that you're approaching it, and also getting you access into that industry.
I'd complement that by saying you could probably learn anything in a few months. If you're dedicating 12 hours a day to learning a skill, even if it's in a category that feels somewhat technical in biotech, etc., you can become somewhat of an expert, to at least enough to be dangerous. So as long as you realize what you don't know as well, within a few months. And so I wouldn't limit your thinking to things you already know. But that said, you need to be passionate about the idea. And so given the amount of work it's going to take, and to Arne's point, if you have a co-founder that's really well versed in the industry and can open the doors, especially in the early days, you're going to need sales, but also to validate the idea, you need to talk to people who are going to be the key decision makers of that idea. That will play a large role, because even though you may learn about it, it may not give you the access you need to be successful in the category.
And actually, one additional comment to that. I think there's a lot of content out there suggesting that when you're looking for a co-founder, you should find someone who has perfect complementary skills to those you have. While obviously in an ideal world that's the case, I would probably index more for the two of you working well together. You're going to be in the trenches together day in, day out for years, and you need to work well. You need to be able to pick each other up when things are rough. You need to cheer each other on along the way. So I would index even more on just you guys working extremely well and knowing each other well, over like perfect complementary skills.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a marriage. You're going to be working together for the next 5, 7, 10, maybe 15 years. And it needs to be someone you really get along with, someone you know is going to have your back, and you can talk through issues and disagreements positively. I mean, one of the main ways companies get killed or die is because the co-founders fight. They fight on the direction, on the execution, on the approach they're taking, and so avoiding that is absolutely key. One of the
100%.
next question is, what do you think of like taking an idea and copying maybe with one differentiator? Is that enough? And I'm not sure if the question was related to an international arbitrage or if it's an idea that's already working in the same country and in the same country copying and doing something slightly different. But would love to your perspective on both of those.
So I think here the devil is very much in the details. I think it depends on what you're changing. So to take an example, if you look at the therapy space, one-on-one, like mental therapy, there's a lot of players, early stage players, many of whom are doing very well. And some of them are working with insurance. So they're working with the Cignas or Aetnas or Uniteds of the world, and they're making it easier for the therapists to get reimbursement and work with patients who have insurance. On one hand, this is great because the consumers don't have to pay as much, so it's less out of pocket for them, which is one of the main churn reasons for mental therapy. It's very expensive if you try to pay for this out of pocket. So on that side, it's great. The flip side is that insurance companies have a lot of negotiation power, and they can typically squeeze you as a therapist on margin, so you don't get a lot of money per session. And then you have to do a fair amount of admin to report to the insurance companies. A lot of the other companies in the space are focused exclusively on out-of-pocket for that exact reason. So they don't take insurance at all, and the consumers pay directly. Therapists love it because they get higher pay per hour, so it's more profitable for them. They can have fewer patients and make the same amount of money. But the flip side there is that they end up losing a lot more of their patients because they're paying maybe 5 times as much per hour. So it's a much higher reason for them to churn. So these are very similar model. It's all one-on-one therapy. They're all going after consumers and therapists, but the change in business model from insurance or no insurance dramatically changes the company. So I think that's a perfect example of when it does make sense to just change one thing and go after the same space.
Yeah, I mean, complementing that, I'd say there are cases like this one where if you change one thing, you completely change the approach, the economics, and it makes a lot of sense. If you're doing an international arbitrage, it can be on the idea side, essentially an exact copy, but you need to adapt it, right? Like typically the payment infrastructures could be different in different countries. The preferences, so if you're an eBay type site, the categories may be different. The delivery infrastructure, the supply chain, if you're an Amazon type company, or the suppliers you have are going to be different. So intelligent adaptation is probably required, but for the most part, as I said, ideas that work in one country work in other countries. So Galileo, it's a funny question, is do you need to be high IQ like Fabrice, Sheldon Cooper, Grinda to be successful in entrepreneurship? Or is it more about faith, dedication to, I guess, the trade, the practice, or an industry?
I think that's a great question. That's probably hard to answer definitively. A lot of people actually think that being too high IQ might be a liability when you're looking at building companies. And the reason for that is that you quickly end up with paralysis by analysis. You want to understand every single aspect, every potential pitfall, everything that can go wrong about your idea, and you never end up pulling the trigger. So someone who is more prone to action and doesn't overanalyze everything is more likely to get started and really execute incredibly well. So I think there's a spectrum here. Obviously, you want to be thoughtful before you start something. You want to do your homework. You want to do a fair amount of research and understanding what you're getting into, because it's much easier to change direction, to change your approach, to change industry before you actually pull the trigger, before you raise money, before you build a team. So you don't want to just jump into things without doing any research. but you can definitely go too far in the other direction as well.
Many of the entrepreneurs I know that are really successful, I would say, are not the highest IQ people. The highest IQ people I know, the problem is a lot of them, if you're in Mensa, they like to solve brain teasers and intellectual problems. And when you're an entrepreneur, a lot of the job is actually not is not intellectually stimulating. Once you've picked the intellectual curiosity part really comes into play when you're picking the idea. So this part. But once you've actually pulled the trigger and it's all execution, a lot of the work you need to do is it's a lot of eating glass, right? Like you're repeating the same story over and over again to investors, to the press, to potential employees. You're dealing with issues that are frankly, for the most part, minute, but the sum total of this minutia done right leads to great entrepreneurship. And really smart people often cannot be bothered. And so the people that have the grit, the tenacity, the passion for the idea, on average, do better. Now, of course, there's some of the smartest people I know who are very successful. And in fact, if you look at the 20 under 20, the Thiel fellowships, where Peter Thiel says, okay, don't go to college, I'll give you 100K. Now, of course, he's actually selected the very smartest people, age 15 to 20, to go and build startups who, in a way, have already done more than their college degree in their personal research and work at that age. And, of course, they can, in a way, bypass college. I don't think a college degree, by the way, is a requirement. In fact, many of the entrepreneurs, the most successful entrepreneurs, are super monomaniacal. The one category that they know well, it allows them to solve all the problems. And actually, if you go to college, especially liberal arts education, teaches you to learn about a lot of different topics. It's not particularly helpful in life. I think it makes you a more interesting human being. I think it's valuable in that regard. But will it make you a better entrepreneur? Probably not. And so from that perspective, it's optional. Now, of course, if you went to Stanford and you studied computer science, your ability to raise money, the networks you build, the fact that you're surrounded by this fabric of society of everyone building startups is actually super helpful. I'll leave it at that. But in general, yeah, not required. Definitely helpful if you have the right network. I think on average, being smart is great. Being too smart, for the most part, has been a detriment, to Arnie's point earlier. Next question is, if you don't know how to execute at this stage yet, because you haven't been in the industry, and I guess it comes back to perhaps an earlier question, how important is that? How important is it to know how you're going to execute?
So I think it is very important to know how to execute. That said, the best, most efficient way to learn how to execute is to go and try to execute. The likelihood that you're going to fail on your first startup, if you've never tried before, if you've never worked in a startup before, is fairly high, but it's going to be the fastest way for you to learn. If you go, you can always go join someone who's building a company in your industry. That's going to be very helpful. It's going to give you a lot of learning. But at the end of the day, that's not going to teach you how to be a CEO. It's not going to teach you how to balance all the priorities, how to be the figurehead that drives the organization forward. The fastest way to learn that is to go and do it yourself. And that might lead to a failure. It might lead to you losing money for investors. But at the end of the day, I do think it's the fastest way to get to where you need to be.
I totally agree. And by the way, failure is not an issue. Like if you failed and you've taken the lessons from that failure, we will back you, right? Like there's nothing we love more than someone who's failed on someone else's dime and they've learned all the things they need to learn. And so for their second startup, we're more than happy to fund you. And it's not true, by the way, in many countries in the world where actually there's a stigma around failure. But I would argue I failed my way to success, right? My first company kind of failed. In the end, I didn't make any money and I had to start from scratch. And most of the things, and it's both mega failure where like the company fails, you go bankrupt, but it's also micro failures. Most of the things you try as an entrepreneur when you're building companies actually don't work. Most of the acquisition channels you try don't work. Most of the product ideas you try don't work. But actually, that's okay. It's that iteration. So you can totally fail your way to success. And you failed your first startup. Frankly, even if you failed your second startup, it's okay. You can keep trying, and people will give you credit for it. Of course, you need to prove and show that you've understood, especially if the reason you failed is you didn't find product market fit, someone out executed you, etc. Like you understood the lessons and you've internalized them in a way that you're going to do better next time.
Totally. And actually, there's been a fair amount of research on this. And statistically, and of course there are outliers in both directions here, but statistically, successful entrepreneurs succeed on their third startup. So even a lot of the success stories that you see out there, the super successful founders, the company you know them for is usually not the first company they built.
So what's your take, Arnie, on needing to create market demand or changing a behavior when you're coming up with an idea? Like it's an idea that makes a lot of sense, would improve the market, but either you need to create demand for it or you need to change the behavior of the existing players.
Yeah, I mean, we are primarily marketplace investors, and we're trying to match demand and supply at scale. So we tend to like industries where there is an established supply-demand relationship, where there is a pain point that you can tap into directly, but where there's broken communication, broken discovery, it's hard to do payments, it's hard to meet up in person to exchange goods. So for marketplaces in particular, I would typically be a little worried if you have to do a lot of education, and especially if you have to change behavior. That is expensive, it takes time. I would rather go after something where you can plug directly into something that's there. I think there are other business models that are probably a little bit more forgiving in changing behavior. If you're building direct-to-consumer brands, for instance, you can acquire a loyal following who care very deeply about what you're doing and how you're doing it and sort of gradually build that over time. But if you're building a marketplace, I would definitely steer clear of those types of concepts.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's so hard. Like changing existing behavior is an entrenched behavior. You need to get lucky. You need to really start the idea at the moment where people are ready to be changing because they realize the error of the old ways. But that timing the market perfectly requires so much luck. So generally, I try to avoid needing to change people's behaviors because people like doing the same thing over and over again, and like doing new things is something they try to avoid. So I think that
totally agree.
Yeah. So I think that's it for this week. Arnie, thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me.
So next week will be, now that we've come up with how to come up with ideas, next week we're going to discuss how to actually validate those ideas. How do we go in depth and make sure that it is worth spending the next 5, 7, 10 years in? And I look forward to seeing you then.